Friends, thank you for being here today. On October 24th, 2025, Wingtech Technology, the Chinese parent company of Nexperia, the world's second-largest discrete semiconductor manufacturer, issued a stark warning to investors. If the company cannot regain operational control of its Dutch subsidiary by December 31st, 2025, financial results will be severely impacted. Simultaneously, Nexperia notified major Japanese automotive clients, including Toyota, Honda, and Nissan, that it can no longer guarantee chip deliveries, triggering panic across global automotive supply chains that depend on the company's 100 billion annual chip production. This is not a routine corporate dispute. This is a semiconductor civil war playing out across two continents, where a Dutch government seized by American pressure controls the headquarters, while Chinese facilities holding 80% of production capacity defy orders from that headquarters, and where a 50-cent power management chip has become the physical manifestation of a geopolitical confrontation that could spiral into actual military conflict. How can a simple, discrete semiconductor, a commodity chip that costs less than a cup of coffee and whose only job is to regulate voltage in car door locks and washing machine control panels, become the trigger point for World War III? How can a company that makes unglamorous but essential components, the kind of chips that generate zero headlines until supply chains collapse, find itself at the center of an international crisis involving forced nationalization, export bans, corporate espionage accusations, and threats that could escalate into shooting wars between nuclear powers? The explanation extends far beyond semiconductor technology or the specifics of Nexperia's business model. It is a narrative of how economic warfare weaponizes even the most mundane global supply chains, how great power rivalry transforms commercial disputes into existential confrontations, and how the doctrine of forcing allies to choose sides in superpower competition creates corporate battlegrounds where workers, shareholders, and customers become casualties of conflicts they neither started nor can escape. The Nexperia crisis represents the inevitable endpoint of America's strategy of weaponizing allied nations in its economic war against China, a strategy we examined in previous analysis of how Washington coerced the Netherlands to seize control of the company on September 30th, 2025. Today's developments confirm the strategic bankruptcy of that approach. China retaliated with an export ban on October 4th that paralyzed 80% of Nexperia's production, creating exactly the supply chain catastrophe that American pressure allegedly aimed to prevent. The company now exists in a surreal state of corporate schizophrenia, with Dutch government-appointed management issuing orders in Nijmegen that Chinese facility managers in Guangdong and Shanghai receive explicit instructions from Beijing to ignore. Employees describe working under two competing command structures, neither of which has legitimate authority over the other's jurisdiction, while customers watch helplessly as their chip supplies evaporate and alternative sources prove impossible to secure within necessary time frames. The immediate trigger for Wingtech's October 24th warning was the expiration timeline for what the company calls temporary control measures. Under Dutch commercial law, emergency government seizures of private enterprises can be maintained for a maximum of 90 days before requiring formal parliamentary approval or judicial extension. The September 30th takeover puts that deadline at December 29th, giving Dutch authorities exactly 66 days from today to either negotiate a resolution with China, force Wingtech into divesting its stake, or convince Parliament to extend emergency powers into 2026. Wingtech's investor notice makes clear the company's calculation. If Netherlands cannot restore normal operations by year-end, Chinese authorities will prohibit Wingtech from consolidating Nexperia's financial results, effectively forcing the parent company to write off its €2.75 billion investment and recognize massive losses that could threaten Wingtech's own solvency. This is not empty posturing. Chinese commercial regulations genuinely prohibit companies from consolidating subsidiaries over which they lack operational control, and Beijing has already demonstrated willingness to enforce such rules regardless of global economic consequences. The notification to Japanese automotive clients represents an even more immediate crisis, with potential to cascade across the global economy within weeks rather than months. Nexperia supplies critical power management chips to virtually every major automobile manufacturer worldwide, with particularly deep integration into Japanese supply chains. These are not sophisticated processors that can be redesigned around. They are standardized commodity components like MOSFETs, IGBTs, and power rectifiers that manage voltage conversion and current flow in everything from power steering systems to window motors to battery management systems in electric vehicles. Qualifying alternative suppliers for automotive applications typically requires 12 to 18 months of testing and certification to meet stringent safety and reliability requirements. Yet Nexperia's current inventory levels give customers perhaps 150 days of buffer before stockouts force production line shutdowns. The automotive supply chain manager at Toyota, who spoke to Bloomberg under condition of anonymity, captured the paralysis. We cannot simply switch suppliers for components integrated into dozens of vehicle platforms. But we also cannot guarantee to our own customers that we can deliver cars if Nexperia cannot deliver chips. The whole system is predicated on reliability, and that reliability has vanished. The human dimension of this crisis manifests most painfully in the experiences of Nexperia employees caught between warring governments. Consider the situation described by Zhang Wei, a 34-year-old production engineer at Nexperia's Guangdong facility, who spoke to South China Morning Post, using a pseudonym to avoid retaliation from Chinese authorities. On September 30th, we received an email from Nijmegen headquarters signed by the Dutch government-appointed manager telling us that John Chang, our VP of Global Sales, was terminated and that we should report to new leadership. 3 hours later, we received a WeChat message from our Chinese facility director saying that Chang's termination was legally invalid in Chinese territory and we should continue reporting to existing management. The next day, we got contradictory orders about which customer orders to prioritize. Some colleagues are following Dutch headquarters instructions. Some are following Chinese management. Nobody knows who actually has authority or whether we're breaking laws by following one set of orders versus another. The December 30th deadline creates a compressed timeline that makes rational negotiation nearly impossible. Dutch officials face conflicting pressures. American threats to add Nexperia to the entity list if Chinese ownership continues versus Chinese threats to permanently ban exports if Dutch government control persists versus European automotive industry demands to resolve the situation before January when vehicle production schedules lock in for 2026 model year launches. Meanwhile, Wingtech faces its own timeline constraints. Chinese commercial regulations require companies to disclose material adverse changes in subsidiary control to stock exchanges within specific windows, meaning Wingtech must either announce consolidation of Nexperia's results or acknowledge loss of control with accompanying financial write-downs. The compressed time frame virtually guarantees that instead of careful negotiation yielding compromise acceptable to all parties, the situation will deteriorate into ultimatums, brinkmanship, and eventually forced choices that satisfy no one while maximizing harm to all stakeholders, including workers, customers, shareholders, and the broader global economy. The broader pattern reveals how American strategy of weaponizing allies creates precisely the vulnerabilities it claims to address. Washington argued that Chinese ownership of Nexperia posed security risks, that sensitive semiconductor technology might flow to China, that supply chain dependencies created leverage for Beijing, that European technological capabilities required protection from Chinese control. Yet the actual result of American pressure has been catastrophic. Global supply chains face imminent collapse. European workers face mass layoffs. Critical technology transfer has accelerated as Chinese engineers rapidly document processes before losing access, and China has gained leverage by demonstrating its willingness to weaponize supply chains in retaliation for Western actions. The core assumption underlying American policy that forcing allies to choose sides would strengthen Western position vis-a-vis China has proven spectacularly wrong. Instead, coerced compliance created corporate battlegrounds where all parties lose while the fundamental geopolitical competition intensifies without resolution. The ASML precedent looms over this crisis as a warning of permanent damage from forced decoupling. When the Netherlands banned sales of extreme ultraviolet lithography machines to China in 2023 under American pressure, ASML lost an estimated $5.7 billion in revenue, while China accelerated development of domestic alternatives that now threaten ASML's long-term market position. Chinese semiconductor equipment manufacturers received massive state subsidies to replicate EUV technology, and while Chinese machines remain inferior to ASML's cutting-edge systems, they improve rapidly, while ASML permanently loses access to the world's largest semiconductor market. The Nexperia situation follows the same trajectory. Forced separation of Chinese ownership from European operations will not eliminate Chinese capabilities, but will instead accelerate Chinese investment in developing competing production capacity, ultimately creating overcapacity and price wars that harm all producers while achieving none of the stated security objectives. The corporate civil war playing out inside Nexperia illuminates how weaponization of allies creates impossible situations with no good outcomes. Zhang Shuazheng, Nexperia's suspended CEO, who remains in legal limbo after Dutch courts removed him on American pressure, described the paralysis in court filings. I received instructions from Wingtech, my legal employer, to transfer certain production orders to other facilities within the corporate group to maintain customer relationships. I received contradictory orders from Dutch government-appointed managers to halt such transfers. Chinese law obligates me to follow Wingtech's instructions. Dutch law requires me to follow court orders. No legal framework exists to reconcile these conflicting obligations. Zhang's dilemma is not unique. Hundreds of managers and employees face similar impossible choices between obeying their legal employer versus obeying government authorities with potential criminal liability regardless of which authority they follow. The economic damage extends far beyond Nexperia itself to affect entire industries and national economies. The automotive sector faces the most immediate crisis, with potential for widespread production disruptions within 90 to 120 days if Nexperia cannot resume normal operations. The Alliance for Automobile Innovation, representing manufacturers producing over 90% of vehicles sold in North America, warned on October 8th that Nexperia's paralysis threatens to trigger the most severe automotive supply chain disruption since the 2021 semiconductor shortage. That shortage, caused primarily by pandemic-related demand shifts and manufacturing disruptions, forced temporary shutdowns of vehicle assembly plants worldwide, reduced global car production by approximately 11 million units, and contributed significantly to vehicle price inflation that harmed consumers throughout 2022 to 2023. The Nexperia crisis threatens similar or worse disruption. Yet unlike the pandemic shortage, which resulted from external shocks beyond human control, this crisis is deliberately manufactured by governments choosing to weaponize supply chains for geopolitical advantage. The broader question concerns Europe's position in an increasingly weaponized global economy where supply chains have become battlegrounds. European industry depends heavily on Chinese trade. The European Union's €850 billion in bilateral trade with China in 2024 exceeds EU-US trade by €130 billion, and China is the largest trading partner for most major EU economies, including Germany, France, and the Netherlands. American pressure to decouple from Chinese economic relationships demands that European businesses sacrifice their largest and fastest-growing market to serve American strategic objectives. European companies that comply face permanent loss of Chinese market access, forcing them to abandon long-term investments and strategic positioning in a market that will likely account for 30 to 40% of global GDP growth over the next decade. Yet companies that resist American pressure face potential entity list designation, loss of access to U.S. technology and markets, and accusations of prioritizing profit over security. The entity list threat hanging over Nexperia demonstrates how American extraterritorial regulatory power functions as a coercion mechanism against allied nations as much as adversaries. Under rules implemented September 2024 and tightened further in September 2025, any company more than 50% owned by an entity already on the entity list automatically faces designation unless ownership structures change. Wingtech was added to the entity list in December 2024. Meaning Nexperia faced automatic designation by November 30th, 2025, unless Dutch or Chinese authorities forced Wingtech to divest its stake. This created the compressed timeline that drove the September 30th Dutch government seizure. American officials made clear to The Hague that failure to act would result in entity list designation that would destroy Nexperia by cutting it off from U.S. technology components and customers who themselves depend on American technology. The December 30th deadline therefore represents not a genuine negotiation window, but a countdown to forced choice between bad options. Option 1. Netherlands maintains government control, forcing Wingtech into selling its stake to non-Chinese buyers, avoiding entity list designation, but guaranteeing permanent loss of Chinese market access and likely Chinese retaliation against other Dutch companies. Option 2. Netherlands returns control to Wingtech, accepting entity list designation that destroys Nexperia's viability in Western markets, but potentially allowing restoration of Chinese operations serving Asian and other markets. Option 3. Some form of trust structure or operational separation that satisfies neither American nor Chinese requirements, likely resulting in entity list designation from Washington and continued export bans from Beijing while achieving none of the objectives of any party. The question is whether the West can maintain technological leadership while cutting itself off from the world's largest market and most dynamic industrial ecosystem. The December 30th deadline thus matters not because it determines Nexperia's fate. The company as a unified global operation is likely already doomed, but because it represents a broader fork in the road where America and its allies must choose between continued weaponization of economic relationships versus acceptance that great power competition requires guardrails preventing escalation into catastrophic outcomes. The weaponization path leads to further fragmentation, higher costs, accelerated Chinese technological development, and erosion of the alliances that America claims to defend. The alternative path, acknowledging that supply chain interdependence serves everyone's interests, that forcing allies to choose sides harms those allies more than adversaries, and that sustainable competition requires preserving commercial relationships even amid geopolitical rivalry, requires abandoning the fantasy that America can coerce China into submission or technological dependence. The employees of Nexperia, Dutch engineers in Nijmegen, German technicians in Hamburg, British specialists in Manchester, Chinese workers in Guangdong and Shanghai face these abstract geopolitical questions as concrete personal crises. Will they have jobs in 6 months? Will their company survive? Will their skills remain valuable or become obsolete as supply chains fragment? They are the human face of what weaponizing allies means. Ordinary workers in allied nations transformed into casualties of geopolitical rivalry they neither chose nor benefit from, sacrificed in service of American strategic objectives that may not achieve their intended goals and that clearly harm the allies forced to implement them. Whether a 50-cent chip becomes the trigger for World War III depends less on the technical specifications of semiconductors than on whether political leaders in Washington, Beijing, and allied capitals can recognize that the path they're on leads nowhere good for anyone. The investor notification from Wingtech revealed another dimension of this crisis. The financial engineering of global supply chains makes clean separation impossible. Nexperia's business model relies on integrated operations, where design occurs in Netherlands, manufacturing spans China and several European countries' locations, sales serves customers globally, and financial structures optimize tax and regulatory requirements across multiple jurisdictions. The company's debt, approximately 2.1 billion euros as of June 2025, is guaranteed partially by Wingtech, partially by Nexperia's own assets, and partially by insurance arrangements involving banks in multiple countries. The parallels with the ASML case illuminate how these forced choices create permanent damage that harms all parties. When Netherlands banned EUV sales to China, ASML's CEO Peter Wennink stated clearly that the company opposed the ban, believed it would ultimately harm Western technological leadership by accelerating Chinese domestic development, and viewed the policy as sacrificing Dutch commercial interests for American geopolitical goals. Wennink was correct. 3 years later, Chinese EUV alternatives progress rapidly, while ASML faces permanent exclusion from the world's largest semiconductor market. The Nexperia situation follows the identical pattern with potentially greater economic damage because Nexperia produces the high-volume commodity chips that form the base of every electronics supply chain. The investor notification from Wingtech revealed another dimension of this crisis. The financial engineering of global supply chains makes clean separation impossible. Nexperia's business model relies on integrated operations, where design occurs in Netherlands, manufacturing spans China and several European countries' locations, sales serves customers globally, and financial structures optimize tax and regulatory requirements across multiple jurisdictions. The company's debt, approximately 2.1 billion euros as of June 2025, is guaranteed partially by Wingtech, partially by Nexperia's own assets, and partially by insurance arrangements involving banks in multiple countries.
Wingtech's warning about inability to consolidate results reflects this complexity. If Chinese authorities prohibit consolidation, Wingtech loses ability to offset Nexperia's revenues against Wingtech's own operations for tax purposes, potentially triggering technical defaults on debt covenants that require specified financial ratios.
The Japanese automotive notification provides the most immediate flashpoint where corporate crisis could cascade into broader economic damage. Japan's automotive sector employed approximately 5.5 million workers as of 2024, accounting for roughly 8% of Japan's GDP when including related industries like steel, glass, electronics, and logistics. Japanese automakers dominate global markets in reliability and precision manufacturing, advantages built on supply chain relationships cultivated over decades. Nexperia's inability to guarantee chip supplies threatens to shut down production lines within months, forcing Japanese manufacturers into impossible choices: delay vehicle launches and lose market share to competitors, redesign vehicles around alternative chips requiring 12 to 18 months that they don't have, or stockpile existing inventory at costs that destroy profitability. The broader question concerns whether the United States comprehends the damage its coercion of allies inflicts on the alliance structure that supposedly underpins American global power. The Netherlands is not an adversary to be coerced. It is a founding NATO member, host to major EU institutions, and historically one of America's closest European allies. Yet American pressure over Nexperia effectively demanded that The Hague choose between Chinese commercial relationships versus American strategic demands, forced nationalization of a private company in ways that violate core principles of market economics that Washington supposedly champions, and created economic damage to Dutch and European interests that erodes the very rationale for maintaining close alliance relationships with Washington. The December 30th deadline creates a scenario where all parties face maximum pain regardless of outcome. If Netherlands caves to American pressure and forces Wingtech's divestment, China will retaliate against Dutch companies operating in China, likely targeting ASML, Philips, Heineken, and the Port of Rotterdam, all of which have major Chinese operations or dependencies. If Netherlands returns control to Wingtech, American Entity List designation destroys Nexperia's Western business, while Republicans in Congress will almost certainly push for secondary sanctions against Netherlands itself for enabling Chinese technology theft. If some compromise emerges, it will satisfy neither Washington nor Beijing, resulting in partial restrictions from both sides that leave Nexperia unable to operate effectively in any major market. The question of whether a 50-cent chip can trigger World War III seems absurd until one examines how economic confrontations escalate into military crises. History offers numerous examples where economic disputes evolved into shooting wars, the trade tensions and resource competition that contributed to both world wars, the oil embargoes that nearly triggered military conflicts in the 1970s, the sanctions regimes that preceded and accompanied military interventions in Iraq and Iran. The Nexperia crisis sits within a broader pattern of U.S.-China confrontation that includes intensifying military tensions in the South China Sea, increasingly frequent dangerous incidents between American and Chinese forces, explicit warnings from military officials about risks of accidental escalation, and the absence of robust communication systems between Washington and Beijing that might prevent incidents from spiraling out of control. The New York Times reported on October 24th that senior U.S. and Chinese military officials increasingly view confrontation as one step from war, citing the dramatic increase in dangerous incidents between forces of both nations and their allies. Chinese fighters released flares dangerously close to Australian patrol aircraft. Chinese Coast Guard vessels rammed and attacked Philippine boats with water cannons. American and Chinese warships nearly collided during freedom of navigation operations. Each incident escalates tensions while degrading the norms and communication channels that might prevent accidents from becoming catastrophes. In this context, economic weapons like the Nexperia seizure are not separate from military tensions, but rather another front in a comprehensive confrontation where economic, technological, and military domains reinforce and escalate each other. The corporate civil war inside Nexperia is thus not merely a commercial dispute, but a microcosm of the broader superpower confrontation and a warning of where American strategy of weaponizing allies leads. When Washington forces allied governments to nationalize private companies, Beijing retaliates by fragmenting supply chains that those companies depend upon. Neither side achieves security objectives. Chinese technological development accelerates regardless of Western restrictions, while Western supply chains become more vulnerable and expensive as redundant capacity develops in isolated ecosystems. Workers in allied nations bear the costs through job losses, pension fund losses, and economic disruption, while consumers face higher prices and reduced product availability. The existential question is whether this trajectory is reversible or whether the Nexperia crisis represents a point of no return where decoupling becomes inevitable regardless of the damage it inflicts. Once supply chains fragment, once trust erodes, once corporations learn that geopolitical risk makes international integration too dangerous, rebuilding takes decades rather than years. The semiconductor industry is particularly vulnerable because its business model depends on high-volume production, achieving economies of scale. Fragmenting the global market into isolated ecosystems raises costs for everyone while reducing efficiency that took decades to achieve. The question is not whether China can develop domestic semiconductor capabilities independent of Western technology. China clearly will through massive state investment, however long it takes. The question is whether the West can maintain technological leadership while cutting itself off from the world's largest market and most dynamic industrial ecosystem. The December 30th deadline thus matters not because it determines Nexperia's fate. The company, as a unified global operation, is likely already doomed, but because it represents a broader fork in the road where America and its allies must choose between continued weaponization of economic relationships versus acceptance that great power competition requires guardrails preventing escalation into catastrophic outcomes. The weaponization path leads to further fragmentation, higher costs, accelerated Chinese technological development, and erosion of the alliances that America claims to defend. The alternative path, acknowledging that supply chain interdependence serves everyone's interests, that forcing allies to choose sides harms those allies more than adversaries, and that sustainable competition requires preserving commercial relationships even amid geopolitical rivalry, requires abandoning the fantasy that America can coerce China into submission or technological dependence. The employees of Nexperia, Dutch engineers in Nijmegen, German technicians in Hamburg, British specialists in Manchester, Chinese workers in Guangdong and Shanghai, face these abstract geopolitical questions as concrete personal crises. Will they have jobs in 6 months? Will their company survive? Will their skills remain valuable or become obsolete as supply chains fragment? They are the human face of what weaponizing allies means. Ordinary workers in allied nations transformed into casualties of geopolitical rivalry they neither chose nor benefit from, sacrificed in service of American strategic objectives that may not achieve their intended goals and that clearly harm the Allies forced to implement them. Whether a 50-cent chip becomes the trigger for World War III depends less on the technical specifications of semiconductors than on whether political leaders in Washington, Beijing, and Allied capitals can recognize that the path they're on leads nowhere good for anyone.